The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Alcor Webinar, Disaster Recovery Solutions on AWS. We will begin in just a few minutes. Alcor is pleased to welcome you all to today's webinar. Alcor is a global cloud advisory and implementation services company serving Fortune 500, government agencies, and other leading organizations in multiple industry verticals across the Americas, Canada, India, Great Britain, and Japan. Alcor is an experienced ServiceNow Elite partner. We also partner with leading technology companies, including AWS, Oracle, Microsoft, FireEye, Encoder, 3C Logic, Celonis, OneTrust, and others. We advise leading businesses on cloud platforms, architecture, enterprise service management, and integrating IT service delivery. We also provide business process consulting to capture, re-engineer, and improve processes that can easily be automated to deliver real value. The Alcor consulting team has excellence in business strategy, cloud technology, and organizational change management. Our ongoing webinar series is designed to inform, enlighten, and start discussions within your own organizations. If you require any additional information after listening to today's webinar, please reach out to us through our website, www.alcortech.com. We have some time reserved at the end of today's webinar for Q&A session, so please feel free to type any questions into the questions section of the webinar dashboard. Today's webinar topic is Disaster Recovery Solutions on AWS, and it's presented by Joan Van Omen and Abbas Abidi. Joan is Solution Architect at Alcor Solutions. He's AWS Certified Solution Architect who worked on cloud implementation projects for two of the world's largest banks and has been working in DevOps space for over a decade. Abbas is a cloud consultant. He has over half a decade experience in cloud computing and ServiceNow implementations. He has experience in implementing solutions on AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud Platform. I will now turn the webinar over to John and Abbas.
Thank you, Anna. And thanks to everyone who's chosen to attend today's webinar. I want to thank you. Today's agenda, we're going to start out with what is disaster recovery. Then we're going to cover on AWS what levels of disaster recovery are available, the advantages of those disaster recovery levels, comparison of disaster recovery levels, what is AWS CloudinYour and what are its advantages, a summary, and then we're going to cover some questions. What is disaster recovery? I think that something that's very important when we are working with customers is to plan the disaster recovery carefully. And the reason why this is so important is because, of course, disaster recovery is a complex topic, but also it can take quite a bit of time and it can be cumbersome. Things have improved a great deal in the last 10 or 20 years, particularly with the premiere of cloud-based disaster recovery solutions. For instance, 15, 20 years ago, the typical way to do disaster recovery was to basically build a replica of one's data center. As you can imagine, this could be extraordinarily expensive. You have to replicate databases, you have to replicate storage, network gear. You need a network link between the two data centers, and that link alone can be very expensive. And probably the worst part about all of that is that sometimes it just didn't work. And sometimes you would not find this out until you'd spent millions, not just on infrastructure and technology, but millions of dollars in man hours trying to set up a duplicate data center. Now you might say, well, why would somebody do that? Why would someone go to such expense and hassle only to fail? And the reason why is that a disaster in your infrastructure can be unbelievably expensive. For instance, imagine if you are a bank and you have financial transactions coming in, and then suddenly you can no longer process those transactions. In situations like that, you're talking about a loss of 6 figures per hour, sometimes even 7. So this is why companies would invest such huge sums in disaster recovery in the past, but now in 2020, we have much better ways to do this. Now, keep in mind that the focus on DR is to keep these technology systems running, and that disaster recovery is considered a subset of business continuity. We're going to talk about a couple of terms which help to define our disaster recovery objectives. First, we have RTO. RTO is the recovery time objective. It's the maximum tolerable length of time that a computer, system, network, or application can be down after a failure or a disaster occurs. An example of RTO that I like to use is ATM machines. So again, I've worked at a number of banks, and as you can imagine, the ATM machines are some of the most important parts of a bank's infrastructure. As you can imagine, customers get very worried if the ATMs stop working. So this means that their recovery time objective has to be very fast. In other words, if there is a disaster, we need the ability to bring them back up in a very rapid fashion. RPO, also known as recovery point objective, refers to your company's loss tolerance, the amount of data that can be lost before significant harm to the business occurs. The objective is expressed as a time measurement from the loss event to the most recent preceding backup. Now, when you look at this term, it might sound like it's a lot like RTO, but they're actually complementary. So to give you an example, going back to our ATM example, with an ATM, it's basically it's a dumb machine that just displays data to the customer at the ATM, at the physical ATM. The actual data lives on a database somewhere else. So with an ATM, the RTO has to be very fast so that the ATM comes back. Now, on the flip side of this is that database. With the database, your most important spec is the RPO. For instance, imagine if you, as a customer, went to the bank and you deposited $10,000, and then somehow that transaction just disappeared because the database went down. So in this situation, you can see that the RPO is very critical. We want to minimize and ideally eliminate any possibility of data loss. So, as mentioned earlier in the presentation, disaster recovery used to be much different years ago. So, years ago, we would basically build a replica of a data center, and everything had to be recreated, often in a different geographic location. In 2020, we can take advantage of the scale of Amazon Web Services, and it just improves everything. This is one of those interesting cases in technology where it's difficult to see any downside here. Everything is improved. In particular, the durability of our data is improved, and this is because Amazon S3 and Amazon Glacier, they offer 99.999999999% uptime. That's right, it's 11 nines. Because of this incredible durability, we achieve a level that would be almost impossible to achieve if you did this with your own data center or your own technology. Again, we're basically just leveraging the incredible scale of AWS. Another great thing about AWS is the cost savings. The reason why our cost savings are possible is because we can implement disaster recovery solutions for the things, the infrastructure that is most important to us, and we can also tier that. So let me give you an example. Again, in the past DR solutions, you just replicate everything. If you had a software repo internally, you'd replicate that. Customer-facing services, you'd replicate that. Your databases, also replicated. With AWS, we can make the decision that there are some things that we can tolerate an outage for, but there's other things which we have much lower tolerance for. So we can tier the data. An example I like to use is an internal software repo. Now, obviously, we do not want to see any kind of data loss with our software repo. But on the other hand, if we can tolerate an outage of 6 hours or tolerate an outage of 8 hours, we can save money, and we're saving money by allowing for a greater RTO. But on the other hand, we don't have to have a high RTO. It is also possible, again, to have tiers, which we'll look at in an upcoming slide. Mapping AWS services. So this is a really fundamental part of why AWS is such a great DR solution, is that there are AWS services that map to just about everything that we have in our data center. We have Route 53 for DNS. We have AWS load balancers. There are web and application servers that can be deployed on AWS, database servers, Active Directory authentication, AWS's multiple availability zones, multi-regions, and of course, multiple DR solutions. So here's a slide showing the tiers of disaster recovery and kind of giving you an idea of how you can dial in your risk tolerance, your budget, and come up with a solution that works best for you. It's not a one-size-fits-all. At the bottom end of the scale is basic backup and restore, basically just putting your data into the cloud. Then we have a pilot-light implementation. And what we mean by this is that we have some services that are running in AWS, and we do this to improve the RPO and the RTO. A warm standby adds additional services, again, at a higher cost, but it just kind of depends on your risk tolerance. And then taken to the extreme, we have multi-site. Multi-site is similar to the traditional disaster recovery solution of having a duplicate data center, but the difference here is that the data center, instead of being a physical data center that you own, you are duplicating your data into the AWS cloud. Here's a diagram showing you what the various components look like. I think the part here that is particularly important is the AWS Storage Gateway that you see there towards the right. When we speak to customers, we often find that their expectation is that if they are going to do AWS DR, that they must move their existing infrastructure into AWS. This is not the case. One great thing about the AWS Storage Gateway is it allows you to implement a hybrid solution. What I mean by this is that the storage gateway allows you to store data into AWS with your on-premises machines. So for instance, let's say that all of your infrastructure is currently on premises. You can replicate your data to AWS via the AWS Storage Gateway. So you can keep your existing infrastructure the same. On the other hand, if you have a mixture, you can do that as well. Basically, the AWS Storage Gateway enables a hybrid solution so that you can implement disaster recovery quite simply, and it expedites the entire process. And with this slide, I would like to hand the microphone to my colleague, Abbas.
Thank you, John. So now we will be discussing about the pilot light architecture for the disaster recovery. So in pilot light model, there is one active production site, and instead of a secondary site, we have a staging area. The staging area has low cost EBS volumes and some replication servers. So continuous data replication happen between the production site and the EBS volumes with the help of these replication servers. In case of a disaster, new servers get created in the secondary DR site, and the EBS volumes of the staging area gets automatically attached to these servers, thus giving less RPO and RTO and then the backup and storage model with low cost staging area. That means you only pay for the resources residing in the staging area and pay for the resources in the secondary site only when there is a disaster. So the next model that we are going to talk about is warm standby architecture. So in warm standby architecture, both the primary and the secondary sites are in active state and are in continuous data replication mode. However, the secondary site is not active for the production traffic in normal operations. It only becomes active at the time of disaster. So from cost perspective, the cost of setting up a warm standby model is more than the pilot light approach, since the secondary site in the warm standby is always up, but it has a lesser RPO and RTO than the pilot light approach. It is good for solutions that require RPO and RTO of around minutes. Now let's discuss about the multi-site architecture, or it is also known as hot standby model. Here, the primary and the secondary sites are both active and are load balanced. That means one acts as the failover of the other, and continuous data replication always happens between them. It is best suited for business critical solutions which requires 0 RPO and RTO. So now we are going to discuss about an AWS service which is based on pilot-light DR approach. So this AWS service is known as CloudinYour. So what is CloudinYour? CloudinYour is a software as a service solution on AWS which offers disaster recovery and migration solutions. The company was founded in the year 2012. It had partnerships with different cloud providers like AWS, Microsoft Azure, GCP, and VMware, but it has now been acquired by AWS and now only offers the DR solutions on AWS. By using CloudinYour's disaster recovery, we can shift our DR strategy to AWS from our existing data centers. CloudinYour has a self-service web-based console through which we can manage all our DR projects. It basically uses block-level continuous data replication through which the target machines are spun up in their most up-to-date state during a disaster or a drill. This helps organization achieve minimum RPOs. The continuous data replication takes place in a low-cost staging area in AWS, which reduces the compute and the storage cost, thus reducing the total cost of ownership. In the event of a disaster, it triggers machine conversion processes that spin up machines in the target AWS region in minutes. This particular thing helps organization achieve RTOs of minutes. Therefore, in short, we can say that CloudinYour DR solution provides the resilience of a warm standby solution at the cost of a cold standby solution. So now let's discuss about the CloudinYour architecture. The CloudinYour is basically consists of three major components. First is the CloudinYour web console, which is the primary user interface through which we can set up our DR projects, define the blueprints, or set up our project. The second component is the corporate data center, or we can call it as a primary site. It can be a physical or a virtual data center. It can be a public or a private cloud. It can also be a part of another VPC in the same cloud. That means in AWS. This is where we identify the source machines which can be considered as good candidates for disaster recovery, and then we install the CloudinYour agents into it. The third and the last component is the AWS cloud. This is where we define the subnets for the staging area and the subnet for the secondary DR site. The staging area consists of the replication servers and low-cost EBS volumes, which are in continuous data replication mode with the primary site. Continuous data replication happens via a secure connection between the primary site and the staging subnet. This can be achieved by using AWS service known as site-to-site VPN, or we can also use AWS Direct Connect, or if it is a part of the same cloud, then we can use VPC peering. Once the replication is complete and the DBs are in continuous data replication mode, then we can initiate a DR test. And then the new machines will be created in the DR subnet. Now let me explain you the CloudinYour process flow. So before beginning, you need to plan your DR project first. And the first step would be to identify the source machines which are good candidates for disaster recovery. After identifying them, you need to establish connectivity between your primary site and the AWS staging area subnet. This can be done with the help of AWS site-to-site VPN or Direct Connect, depending upon the data flow. If the primary site and the DR site is in the same cloud but in different VPCs, then we can also establish the connectivity via VPC peering, as I mentioned earlier. Then you need to configure your project in the CloudinYour portal by configuring the AWS access and the secret key. You define there the staging area subnet, the secondary site or the DR site subnet, and the VPN information. After setting up the project, you will get a token and link to install the agents into your source machines. After you install the agents and after you configure the token in the source servers, the continuous data replication will begin in the staging area. And then we can monitor that from the CloudInyo portal. For each source machines, we need to define a blueprint of the target server that will be created in the secondary site. Once the machines are in continuous data replication state, then the DR state changes into ready for testing. After that, we can test for the failover. After the failover, we can check if the target machines are spun up in the same form as we expected. Once the tests are successful, then the state of the machine changes to recently tested. After that, we can initiate a DR anytime. After a successful DR, we can initiate a failback. This step terminates the data replication. Once the failback is complete, the DR comes back to the normal operations. So this is how the process flow of CloudInyo. Now let's talk about the best practices that we need to follow while setting up a DR project. So we need to decide the subnets for the staging area and the secondary site before planning a DR project. We need to ensure that there is proper connectivity between the primary site and the staging area on AWS. We need to ensure that we have created an IAM user with programmatic access on AWS and have attached CloudInyo IAM policy with it. We also need to ensure that we have reviewed the blueprint options for our specific target locations. As the price of CloudInyo disaster recovery is calculated on an hourly rate per source server, which is around $0.028 per source server, we need to ensure that we only install the agents to the source machines which we really need for the DR. It is also recommended to use one CloudInyo project for around 300 machines or less. We need to ensure we perform a test prior to proper disaster recovery. After testing, we need to ensure that everything is working correctly in the DR site. So these were the few best practices that we need to follow in setting up a DR on CloudInyo. Now let's talk about the CloudInyo benefits. Since you only pay for the low-cost staging area that CloudInyo hits during continuous application, and you pay for the fully provisioned resources only during a disaster drill or while recovery, so there is a significant reduction in the total cost of ownership. Because of continuous data replication between the primary and the staging servers, sub-second RPOs can be achieved. As the target machines can be quickly spun up based on the configuration defined in the blueprints, so RTOs of few minutes can be achieved. It also gives you an option for point-in-time recovery. So in the cases of data corruption, ransomware, or any other malicious attacks, failover to the earlier versions of the replicated servers is possible. It also gives you an option for one-click failback. So when your primary site is up, you can quickly fail back to it and continue with the normal operations. CloudInyo gives you an option to perform unlimited number of DR drills. Now, let me walk you through the CloudInyo console. So this is the setup screen. Here we can check our licenses or the source servers where our agent is currently running. We can also define or change our AWS credentials. We can define the replication settings like the AWS region for our replication or the staging area, the staging subnet, security groups. In the other settings, we can get the details about our installation token, and we can configure settings like renaming a project and configuring email notifications and etc. So in this screen basically shows the list of machines which has CloudInyo agent installed into it. So from here we can track the process of data replication into the staging area. We can also check the DR lifecycle of the machines like whether it is ready for test or it has been tested recently. Once you click on the machine, and then you get these options to define the target machine blueprint. Here we can define this instance type, the subnet, the security groups, a private IP, and we can define all these things here. So once there is an actual DR, so the new machines that will be provisioned in the DR site will have these configurations. You can also, while testing for recovery, you can choose for different snapshots, which are helpful in case of database corruptions, ransomware, or other malicious attacks in your environment. So that was all from the CloudinYour side. I will now give the webinar controls back to John, who will now cover the advantages of using DR on cloud. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Abbas. That was a great description of CloudinYour, a really amazing product that you've done a lot of work with, and I really appreciate you showing us its advantages. I know that you've done a lot of great work with it. So let's talk about the advantages of disaster recovery in the cloud. I know that disaster recovery isn't an exciting subject, but it's just incredible how much it's improved. A lot of the customers that we work with, they tend to fall into two different groups. So we see some companies that are very large that have disaster recovery solutions that they've implemented 10 or 15 years ago, sometimes 20 years ago. And those disaster recovery solutions are expensive and cumbersome, and they satisfy the requirements, but they cost a lot of money and they require a lot of care to keep running. Companies like this, they're really concerned about compliance. They're really concerned about durability. So for instance, if you're a bank or you're an investment house or you're a medical company, compliance is a huge concern. If you have data which gets lost or corrupted, there are legal consequences, there are fines involved. So the data absolutely must be cared for. It's of utmost importance to have data durability. So for companies like this, they've implemented disaster recovery solutions decades ago. And again, they're very expensive and they cost a lot to keep up. They require a lot of care. The other kind of companies that we see are smaller companies who've just looked at the situation and said, you know what, I'm just going to hope for the best. I don't have a disaster recovery solution. I don't have a backup data center. Of course, you know, companies like this, they will have backups on site, and they'll have, you know, replicate their disks and things like this, but that's not a real disaster recovery solution. You know, we're talking about companies who look at the situation, they've said, you know, well, I haven't had a disaster yet, so I'm hoping that I don't have a disaster soon. The interesting thing about cloud disaster recovery is that it applies to both sets of customers. Cloud disaster recovery offers so many advantages. I'm hard pressed to find any good reason that you'd want to do disaster recovery any other way, because disaster recovery in the cloud allows for a granularity so that you can decide, you know, well, my databases are exceptionally important to me and I want to have a very low RPO and a very fast RTO. On the other hand, you can also say, you know, well, I've got this software repo and, you know, people are doing commits a couple times a day, and if it's unavailable for 6 hours, you know, I can live with that. And then you might have other infrastructure where, you know, you can tolerate a downtime of a day or two. With cloud-based disaster recovery, you can completely dial in your risk tolerance. By doing so, this saves you money, but more importantly, it's also much easier to implement. Again, in the past, when companies wanted to do disaster recovery, they had to purchase servers and network gear. They had to send engineers out to some other state to wire it all together. They had to install software. I have seen disaster recovery solutions in the past that took a year, even 2 years to implement. With AWS, you can implement a disaster recovery solution in a matter of days. And as Abbas demonstrated, we have the expertise to do that. Let's talk about how Alcor can help. We have a great deal of experience with cloud and with disaster recovery. We can help you determine, what is important to you. We can help you tier that data. We can help you come up with a plan that can address both your risk tolerance and your budget. We can also review how things are going. And if you reach out to us at john.vanomen@alcortech.com or abbas.abidi@alcortech.com. That's abbas.abidi@alcortech. We can go over your current situation for free, of course, free consultation, and we can help you come up with a disaster recovery solution that is custom suited for your personal enterprise. And in this part of the discussion, I'd like to take any questions.
Thank you so much, John and Abbas, for delivering such a wonderful webinar. We do have a few questions here. However, before we proceed to reviewing them, I wanted to remind everyone on the line, if you guys have questions, feel free to send them to us in the chat box. We will be able to read these questions out, and both John and Abbas would be able to address them. And as of right now, let's start with a couple first questions that we have. Here is the first question I have for you guys. Is it possible to use the cloud for disaster recovery without moving my primary workloads to the cloud?
Yep, you can install the CloudinYour agents into your servers that exist in your physical or virtual data centers, or even in your other public or private clouds. And then you can plan your DR or CloudinYour in AWS. That is possible.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much for addressing this, Abbas. Let's move on to the next question I have. How is the pricing calculated for CloudinYour disaster recovery solution? Do you pay per agent? Do you pay per the storage that are you using?
Yeah, so the pricing is calculated per agent on a per hour basis, which is around $0.028, I think, per agent. And along with that, you pay for the cost of the staging area, which has EBS volumes and few replication servers, depending upon your source servers. So that is what you pay for.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much for that answer. The next question I have here is, what is the size of the replication server used in CloudinYour DR solution?
Yeah, interesting. So the default size is T3.small, which has the capability to support the replication of at least 15 servers. But you can customize. You can always customize it as per your needs. You can define, if you think that there is a high load, then you can, modify the size of your replication server. But T3.small is the default size of the replication server.
All right, thank you. Here is another question that we just received. While doing failback, does CloudinYour will terminate the newly launched EC2 machine? So basically,
Yep,
would it terminate or not?
Yeah, it will terminate, and once the failback is complete, then like you set up the initial DR, the primary side and the staging area, it will be back to the normal operations and continue. But in case of failback, the data replication that was happening earlier will cut down, and then once the the solution is back to the normal operation, then the data replication will begin.
Great, awesome. And here is another question that we just got. How can I protect myself against ransomware attacks?
Mind if I take this one, Abbas?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, cool. So this was something I saw about CloudinYour, and when I saw this, I just thought this was the greatest thing ever. So a few years back, we had a fair number of customers who were experiencing issues with the WannaCry ransomware. You may remember this from about the 2017 era. Globally, there was about 74,000 Windows machines that were infected with this particular ransomware. And so the way that this worked was that when the system was compromised, the IT staff would either have to pay a ransom in Bitcoin of 300 Bitcoin to get the machine back, or they would just have to reprovision the machine. And so, as you can imagine, for basic stuff, like a desktop computer or a laptop, you just reprovision the system. But if you have a critical system that's infected, like you might just have to pay that ransom. You can't lose your data. And so there were quite a number of organizations globally which were impacted by this, and quite a few that actually paid the ransoms. So one thing that's kind of amazing about CloudinYour, again, with traditional disaster recovery solutions, you have to pick a single RPO. And so, what I mean by that is that you have to pick a single recovery point objective in time, and you have to say, well, that's the point that I'm going back to. With CloudinYour, you can have multiple RPOs. So for instance, if you had a system that was on premises or even in the cloud that was infected with ransomware, if your RPO was at a point that the system had been infected, you can go back further. And even more amazing about it is you can even dial in the level of tolerance that you have. So for instance, you could have a single RPO per day, or you could have multiple. You could set up an RPO for 6 times an hour. It's just, it's like one of these things about the cloud where it's just incredible, because it's like this technology was, nearly impossible 5 or 10 years ago. And, again, I'm being, full disclosure, I admit I'm kind of strange that I get excited about disaster recovery. It's generally a dry topic, but I just think it's so incredible that this technology exists and so few people have heard of it. So, again, kind of going back to our, how Alcor can help you, reach out to John Van Omen at Alcor Tech, or Abbas Abidi at Alcor Tech, or just Google us on LinkedIn and reach out to us there, and we can completely help you, walk you through the advantages. And again, the consultation is free.
All right, awesome. Well, I don't have any more questions here. So I wanted to thank you all for joining this webinar. Thank you to our wonderful presenters, John and Abbas. Thank you, guys. We will see you at our next webinar next month.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.